The oldest known formulation of the problem of evil comes from Epicurus. This is quite a useful quotation to use to show a different understanding of the problem of evil other than just the classic inconsistent triad. I like Epicurus's quote because I think if you are able to paraphrase Epicurus but use some of the language that he uses, then it just demonstrates to the examiner that you have got a wider knowledge than the normal textbooks. And some of the terms to pick out are things like the idea of willing and able. And then also the opposite. So if God is willing, that would mean that he is omnibenevolent. But Epicurus says, if God doesn't seem to want to do anything, then that might make us think that he's malevolent. But if we believe that God is able to do anything, but he doesn't seem to do anything about evil, then that might mean that God is actually feeble. He's not omnipotent. And so if you use these four terms, you are showing to the examiner that you have read a primary text and you understand how someone from over 2,000 years ago formulated this problem. And so what we're left with Epicurus is saying, well, if we are left with a God that is neither willing nor able, and so therefore is malevolent and feeble, then he isn't God. But if he is both willing, so he wants to do something about it, and he's able to do it, from what source then are evils? Where do evils come from? So this is a classic formulation of what we now call the problem of evil. So J.L. Mackey's inconsistent triads from his book called The Miracle of Theism is a classic way of explaining the logical problem of evil. And so what we have are three terms. God is omnipotent, God is omnibenevolent, and evil exists. This inconsistent triad does not talk about God being omniscient. So please do not mention that God is omniscient, and that is one of the aspects of the inconsistent triad, because it's not. And so the idea of the inconsistent triad is that these three statements are inconsistent with one another. They contradict one another. And this is the excerpt from The Miracle of Theism. And so what Mackey is trying to say is that immediately those three statements aren't a contradiction. But if we add at least the initially plausible premises that good is opposed to evil, then a wholly good omnipotent being would eliminate evil completely because he would oppose it. So then if there really are evils, then there cannot be any such being. So as Mackey says, this is a logical problem because the theist has several beliefs, the three that we've just seen on the inconsistent triad, which contradict one another. The other type of problem of evil is not a logical problem, but it's called the evidential problem. And this is more to do with people's general experiences of evil, the sheer amount of it. And I would say for most people, this is probably the problem of evil that they would use in their everyday discussions. How could God let this happen? Why do some suffer more than others? Why has this happened? How could an all-loving God do this? So they're not talking about a logical contradiction. They're talking about the very real experience of evil and suffering. So if you did get an exam question that said, explain the nature of the problem of evil, you would be expected to talk about the difference between moral and natural evil. So moral evil being the evil and suffering that is brought about by the free actions of human beings. Natural evil being that which isn't brought about by humans, that's part of the world, so things like tsunamis and earthquakes. Then have a paragraph talking about the logical problem of evil, another paragraph talking about the evidential problem. Now, something that you can use to help you discuss the evidential problem is a really famous part of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. Now, in this excerpt, Dostoevsky, with three examples of three stories, raises the question as to why innocents suffer. So in the first one, we have an animal, and the last two, we have innocent children who have done nothing wrong, who are innocent but suffer in horrendous ways. And these three stories were actually in Russian newspapers at the time when he was writing it. And so what we have is Ivan, who's a character in the book, challenging his brother's faith. He's saying, how can this be correct? How can we allow and try and justify the suffering of innocence? And what he says is that the world of knowledge is not worth that child's prayer, is not worth innocents crying out to God, asking him to help them. And I love this part of it where it sounds very much like Augustine's theodicy, which we're going to discuss next. I saw nothing of the sufferings of grown-up people. They have eaten the apple, but these little ones. So he's trying to say they haven't done anything wrong. They haven't eaten the apple, so that imagery referring to Adam and Eve. They do not deserve it. And he goes on passionately to say that if we must suffer, including innocence, for eternal harmony to get into heaven, then I don't want anything to do it. I give back my entrance ticket. I want nothing to do with it. And this is a really good example to use in an essay, either in a part A for explaining the nature of the problem, or a part B where you are trying to really engage with the issue. So the term used for a theory which tries to justify the problem of evil is known as the theodicy, and this comes from two words, theos meaning God and dike meaning righteousness. So a theodicy is a theory which tries to explain why evil exists, and it's trying to uphold the righteousness of God. So Augustine's theodicy has been the basis of main church teaching, and this is where we get the idea of original sin, which many people have heard of. Now, Augustine very much wants to emphasize that evil has got nothing to do with God. And so he turns to the Bible and takes a very literal view of Genesis 3. And he says, when we look in Genesis 1, creation was perfect. God saw what he made and it was good. Evil isn't a substance. It wasn't something that was created by God. It's something that just is a result of something not being good. So lacking goodness, and he calls this privatio bono, privation of good. So in the same way, blindness isn't an actual thing, it's just when you lack sight. So how does this perfect creation go wrong? So he says, first of all, we have what he calls the fall of angels. And so the perfect creation is good. When the angels turn away from God, we have a disharmony occur. And so now the perfect creation has a lack of goodness in it. And then after that, as we see in Genesis 3, we have the fall of man. And so Adam and Eve are led into temptation. They are then punished by God and they are sent out of the Garden of Eden. And he says, so we have this lack of goodness or evil occurring in the world, not through the fault of God, but through the free actions of humans. And he says natural evil is not a creation of God, but is a result of the disharmony brought about by the fall of angels and man. And he says we all deserve punishment because we were all seminally present in the loins of Adam. Because at that time they believed that men contained within their loins all of their potential children. So we were all contained within Adam's loins. So we share in responsibility. And he says, through God's grace and through God's love, some of us will be saved, and he sent Jesus in order to help us. But some of us will go to hell, and we deserve it because we are corrupted, we are led into temptation, and we lack goodness. But some of us, through God's grace, will be saved. Now, there are a lot of issues with Augustine's theodicy. So we know that now that we weren't seminally present in the loins of Adam. This isn't biologically correct. And this is the key issue. If we were not seminally present in the loins of Adam, then therefore, is it fair if we are punished for the sins of Adam, even if we had nothing to do with it? And even if we were seminally present in the loins of Adam, is it fair that we are sharing in responsibility for something that we didn't really have any control over? There's also a logical error. How could a perfect creation go wrong? And for some, they feel unhappy that evil is just seen as a lack of goodness. For some who experience evil, they feel like it's so much more than that. It also relies heavily on the literal interpretation of Genesis. There are many Christians who believe that this story is a myth. Now remember, in philosophy, by myth we don't mean it's untrue. It's a story that's maybe not historically accurate, that might use symbols and metaphors, but it still contains truths. So, for example, if you see Genesis as a myth, it contains truths. God created the world, etc. And so for many people, they wouldn't be able to accept that Adam and Eve actually is a historically accurate account. Now, a very different approach to the problem of evil comes from Irenaeus. Irenaeus is earlier than Augustine. His theodicy is not as influential, and it's not really discussed until later Hick develops it. Now, he sees the fall of Adam and Eve in a different way. Augustine sees it as catastrophic, it's a disaster, whereas Irenaeus sees it as something as a result of our immaturity. Adam and Eve were like children, they were immature, and they were not able to take on being perfect. They weren't ready for it. And he gives an example of babies. Babies can't take a full dinner. They have to be weaned, so they start on milk and then solid, slightly mushy foods, and then eventually solids. In the same way, we are not capable of receiving God's goodness completely. We're not able to be completely perfect, and so we have to develop over time and mature. And by maturing, we are going to make mistakes. We're going to cause suffering to others, but we also need to experience suffering in order to respond and to develop and grow in it. And he uses Genesis 1:26, let's make man in our image, in our likeness. And he said, God created us in his image, and we need to develop into the likeness. And so evil is needed in this world as it leads humans to a greater good and spiritual testing. The other example that he uses is the story of Jonah and the whale. So those of you who do not know this story, it's worth a quick read. There are lots of summaries on the internet. Jonah tries to turn away from God, and in doing so, he ends up at sea. He falls into the sea, and he is swallowed by a giant fish. Now, Jonah had to suffer in that whale, and while he's therein for 3 days, he realises his mistake, and he repents, and he asks for God's forgiveness. So only through suffering was he able to spiritually develop and grow and learn as to what he should have done. Now, Irenaeus, and this is a key difference with him and Hick, is that he argues that some will go to hell. Those who continue hard in themselves, that do not allow God to work with them and to develop, will go to hell. Now, Hick in The Evil and the God of Love goes through the whole history of the problem of evil, and within it he disagrees with Augustine, and he instead says that Irenaeus maybe had a better idea about how to respond to the problem of evil. And so what Hick does is he takes Irenaeus' idea and he develops it. Now, he develops it in 4 main ways: soul-making universalism, counterfactual hypothesis, and epistemic distance. Now, try and associate Hick with these things, and they will help you to remember the key points that you need to explain in an essay. So he calls this world the veil of soul making, and he says the purpose of this world is to develop our souls, to develop and respond to evil so that we can become better. Now, one of the key differences between him and Irenaeus is that Hick advocates universalism. He argues that everyone will eventually go to heaven. He says clearly some people are not ready to go to heaven. They haven't made their soul by the time of death. So, for example, if we think about Pol Pot or Hitler, any of the terrible tyrants that we can think of, they clearly aren't ready to go to heaven. So he sort of puts forward that maybe there's some kind of purgatory or afterlife after death whereby we continue our development. It's a controversial element which we will discuss later, whereas Irenaeus said that some people will go to hell. He doesn't take a literal view of Genesis, so we can see this as a benefit, maybe for a more modern audience. He said this is more of a myth to teach us about temptation and falling away from God. He also says that God created us an epistemic distance, and episteme means knowledge, so we're at a distance of knowledge, a gap of knowledge. This distance of knowledge means that God, it's not absolutely obvious that God exists. It's as equally obvious that maybe he does exist or he doesn't exist, and it gives us complete freedom so that we can spiritually develop. Brian Davies gives an example of this, of a king and a servant girl. The king could order the servant girl to worship him, but to love him. if she did love him, it wouldn't be true love, it wouldn't be meaningful. Whereas if the servant girl came to love the king, then that would be true and meaningful love. And this kind of reminds me of Beauty and the Beast. It's amazing that Belle falls in love with the Beast even though he's got an awful exterior, but she still comes to love him, and that's real love. And so in the same way, we are at distance of knowledge of God, and so if we do come to love him and know him, even though he's not obvious, then that would be a lot more meaningful. Now, something that people tend to struggle with is something called the counterfactual hypothesis. This sounds a lot more complicated than it is. A counterfactual hypothesis is where you counter the facts. You think about, what if this had been different? So many people say, why couldn't the world been perfect? Why couldn't everyone have just freely chose to do good? Why could there be no evil and suffering? So Hick says, right, let's think about that. Now, if it was like that, we wouldn't be able to develop our souls. We would have nothing to respond to. We wouldn't be able to be courageous to do charitable work. And we wouldn't be freely choosing to love God and obey him. And this, he said, wouldn't be good for soul development. So therefore, this world must suit the purpose of soul development. And therefore, it's a good world. He says the reason why God creates imperfect rather than perfect beings is because goodness, as we discussed earlier, freely chosen is more valuable. So I've just outlined a couple of quotes here that I think are really useful for Hick. And I think especially the first one, he's saying we shouldn't judge the world just by how much pleasure and pain it has in it, but how suitable it is for the purpose of soul making, which might be quite useful as the point in part B, as a response to the challenge, well, why is there so much suffering? And also the second one is just more about what we mean by the epistemic distance. So problems with the Irenaean theodicy, if we take Hick, lots of people struggle with the idea of universalism. Is this justice if everyone will eventually go to heaven? There's one which reminds me very much about Dostoevsky's point in The Brothers Karamazov, is that is it fair that for our own spiritual development some are going to suffer, especially the suffering of innocence? Can we really justify, is it justifiable for me to be charitable or brave that others have to suffer for it? And what is the point really of any of that suffering if it's just for us to go to heaven, if everyone goes to heaven? Really, could there not be an alternative way for us to get something? If you think about the terrible things that happen to people in the world, can we really justify that if everyone eventually will go to heaven?